So the date is wrong on this, but just as a heads up, the Wednesday before Thanksgiving, the Wednesday after Thanksgiving, I can just about guarantee you I will not be here. We're going to be taking a trip out to Arizona and on into California and then back. That's probably going to be a yearly thing. So just have that aware in your calendars and planning. So this lesson, talking about the Roman Republic, remember we've gone through the intertestamental period all the way up to the point of just where we're going to meet King Herod, and we stop. And now we're going to go back in time, and we're going to cover the development of the Roman Empire. Now, one of the main reasons we're doing this is, one, you can see some of the amazing things that come out of the fulfillment of Daniel's prophecies concerning the Roman Empire. Two, there are things that are going to come out of this that are going to help you understand certain things within the New Testament that are spoken of. Three, I want you guys to see how similar the Roman Empire was to the United States. There is a very strong similarity between them and us, and other small details. And then the fourth, it's going to give you some insight into the Roman mentality and how people saw Rome, period, and how open it was to different ethnicities and so on and so forth, and why that was the case. All right, so first, the founding of Rome. The founders of Rome were said to be descended from Aeneas. How many of you guys have ever read the Aeneid? The Aeneid, or depending on how your teacher happened to pronounce it. Have you guys ever read the Travels of Ulysses? So when you read the Odyssey, is what the Travels of Ulysses be. Usually at some point in school we have to read some part of the Odyssey. What you have is the Battle of Troy and the Trojan Wars. Ulysses leaves and he's on his way home, his ship gets blown off, and he has all of these different travels. The Aeneid is the same thing, except instead of being with Ulysses, it's with Aeneas, and Aeneas is a prince from Troy. So Ulysses is one of the Greeks on the Greek side of the Trojan War, having that adventure going. The Aeneid is Aeneas leaving Troy as the defeated party and going to find a new home. And so with Aeneas, his travels, according to the story of the Aeneid, he would be in the yellow. Ulysses, his travels are in the red. So as Ulysses is blowing off course and going all these different places and everything else, and then finally, eventually gets home, Aeneas goes through this section and lands here in Italy, and then he establishes a colony there. And so when he establishes the colony there, the people group that are there in the area of Rome are the Latins, because that's the language that they speak. But Aeneas would have probably spoken Greek or some form of Greek. But they land and you end up picking up the Latin language, learning the Latin, and then Aeneas founds Alba Longa, which is kind of the first Roman city, you could say. And as that city develops, they absorb not just the Latin language, but also some of the surrounding cultures that are there. And this colony would have been around 1200, 1100, probably 1100 BC. The Battle of the Trojan War was around that time. Now, do any of you remember from the Old Testament class about what is happening around 1100 BC? Okay. This is the end of the Judges period. This is when Samson and Eli, Samson wrapping up his Judges period, Eli being the high priest, and then the ark being taken, and then Samuel coming in. So that's, during those stories, is when you would have the very first fledgling start of what would be the Roman colony. And then you get, from there, it's founded by, from there, you have another city that is founded, and it's founded by two twins. Now, basically what happens is Julius, who founds Alba Longa, he becomes king, and he has a series of sons who reign over Alba Longa. But there is one king who is deposed by his, I think it's his nephew. The nephew rises up and deposes the king. And then Romulus and Remus are born in the line of the king that was deposed, and the uncle or the nephew, whichever that deposed him, in order to avoid being overtaken by Romulus and Remus, these twins that were born, he has them, he commands them to go and to be exposed. In other words, to go and be killed. And so, similar to the story of Moses, they're taken and they're put into the river, the Tiber River, in a trough. But the trough, they're put in flood stage, and they end up washing up into an area that when the water recedes, they instead are left alive in the trough. Then the legend goes that it was a she-wolf that found them and nursed them back to health, and then they were found by a shepherd, and the shepherd then took care of them. Now the shepherd's wife, her name was the Latin word for wolf, so there might have been something in that that was there. The word for wolf was like lupin, and her name was like Luba or something like that. So that's what some think. But basically, these twins end up growing up, and they end up deposing the uncle and putting the grandpa back in charge. And then they go and found their own city, which they start in the place where Rome is, but it was not called Rome yet because you had Romulus and Remus. And as the story goes, Romulus was building the wall around his section, and Remus made fun of how slow they were going, and so Romulus just killed them. And so now we have Rome instead of Rome. We could have had the Roman Empire and the Greco-Roman, culture, but instead it's Rome. And so this founding of Rome with Romulus and Remus is said to be around 753 BC. There are some that doubt that date. I don't doubt that date. A lot of the stuff that they record, yes, there's a lot of mythological aspects like the she-wolf nursing them and so on and so forth. But at the same time, archaeology supports something being there at this time, and there are other aspects that clearly match with it and would seem to support it. One instance is that when they first founded the city, in order to populate the city, they brought in all these, castaways and basically thieves and people who've been kicked out of everywhere else. They brought in and populated the city with that, but it was all men and they didn't have any women. So very similar to the story that you hear in Judges, you have them going out to one of the nearby tribes, the Samnites, and they wait until the men are distracted at some festival, and they run out and they just grab the women and they run with the women. And then you end up having them come to fight against the Romans to get the women back, only as what's portrayed in some of the Renaissance paintings. I forget what it's called, the rape of the Samnite women or something to that effect. By the way, that word rape is from the Latin to carry off and to carry away, and so it's not necessarily in the Latin implying what it does now in the English. In the picture that's in those paintings, you see the women running in and stopping the battle because they had fallen in love with their Roman husbands, and so on and so forth. Now, what's interesting is that the Roman wedding ceremonies then, for centuries, when the husband would go to take his wife, it was pretend, but he would always show up to her house and take her by force and go. That was part of the Roman wedding, which the one author said, well, that's probably where this legend came from. But when you read what happened in the book of Judges, and you realize yeah, that was something that happened back in that day. You realize it probably was true, and that's more likely where the tradition came from. So anyway, so that's how the city started, was this brigandage and people from all different places. So there was not a single ethnicity within Rome, and that factors into the culture of Rome and its founding, because it's not, you're not looking for this purity of ethnicity. It has more to do with family descendants and so on and so forth. So early Rome has no specific ethnic identity, and it absorbs the cultures that surround it. The biggest culture, so even though they absorbed the language of the Latins, the culture of the Etruscans to the north of them is where they actually got most of their culture from. And so you have then Rome here. They're amongst where the tribe of the Latins were. You have the Etruscans, the Sabines, and the Samnites. That is, if you're reading the history of early Rome, though, that's a lot of what you're hearing. The great feared people were the Gauls that were up in this valley of the Po River. These Gauls eventually get either pulled into Rome or they flee into France. France was also where Gauls were. This was called Cisalpine Gaul because it was this side of the Alps, and then Transalpine Gaul for the other side of the Alps. Now, when Rome was founded, it started on these hills. So you have them forming, I think one started on Capitoline Hill, and then like Esquiline and the Palatine. So there were different little villages and that they set up that eventually merged into one city. And how many hills do you see here that Rome is built upon? 7. Any significance of that?
Perfect number.
Okay. Look at the coin and the reference there in your picture in your notes. So when Revelation references this prostitute sitting on the dragon with the 7 heads, and he says these 7 heads are 7 hills upon which she sits, the people of the first century would have immediately went, Rome. Now, I've heard people debate back and forth as this, and you can see by the coin, you have to look a little bit close because at first you don't see all 7 of the hills, but there are actually 7 hills on the coin, and that was what Rome was known as a city on 7 hills. And these are those 7 hills: the Aventine, the Capitoline, the Palatine, the Catiline, Esquiline, Viminal, and Quirinal, or Quirinal. Those 7 hills were where there were settlements that had all come together into one city. Now, going on, and I think, it looks like I somehow blocked one of my lines with a picture there. This is what Rome looked like at one point, because today if you go, it's with all the stuff built up around it, it's hard to see. Like as you look at this, it's hard to see where the different hills are. But you can see that they had different hills all kind of fortified, and then they just connected them with the wall around all of that. And that was basically what Rome was. The Tiber River flows right through, and that's how they got a lot of their shipping out to the coast. Ostia is the port that's on the actual sea that would have been connected with Rome. So, Romulus, the kings of Rome. Rome starts with a period of kings that goes bad, and then they throw off the kings and they start this form of government called a republic that begins to evolve and grow and change. And it's the form of government that the founding fathers of the United States based our government on. We did not base our government on Greek cities. Greek cities were true democracies where it's a 50%, 51% vote, you win, and that's it. A republic is a different form of government than just that. So the kings of Rome, first you have Romulus. He reigned during the beginning of Isaiah's prophetic ministry. So that gives you guys a little bit of where you're at in Scripture. He's the one that populated Rome with the fugitives and then established the class system of Roman society. Now, basically what happens is the founding members of Rome become the patristic or the patrician class. And that just comes from the Latin pater for father. And so they are the high class, and then you have the plebeians who are the low class. Now, we have to be careful that we don't think of high class and low class the way we do here in America, because high class means you're wealthy, low class means you're not. That's not the way that it was with although it roughly was that way at certain times. You actually had very poor patricians, and you had very wealthy plebeians. How many of you have ever been to India or gotten better acquainted with Indian society and the caste system? So one of the things when we went and visited these Hindu temples that were out in LA area, part of one of my classes for seminary was we actually went and visited these different locations to observe them. And we went to a high caste temple, which was an old Methodist church. That was sad. But you went to this old Methodist church, and you went in, and it still looked like an old Methodist church, and had some of these, a table with idols here, and all these different idols there, and the different ways they had done it. And then right next door was a low caste temple, and it was gorgeous, way nicer than the high caste temple. Now, part of the reason for that is the high caste didn't want to leave India because they weren't really that wealthy. It's just in India they were high caste, so everybody respects them. You get to America, they don't care who you are. So they don't really leave. So there wasn't as many there, whereas the lower caste came to America and they were wealthy, very wealthy. And in India, you could still be wealthy and be low caste, and you can't marry anybody who's high caste. You can't get into that, and you can have all the wealth you want, but you're not going to have any upward mobility. That's one of the draws of America, is that it doesn't matter what you're born into. You can come here, and if you make the money, you move up in class. And that's the American dream. Now, in Rome, it didn't start that way, but it eventually moved that way. And what our founding fathers based our Constitution on is what developed over the centuries, and when Rome got to that more inclusiveness that is similar to what we have. And so he laid the foundation for the Roman Senate. At first, it started off as just a representative of each family within the city. And then as it grew, it became those plus a representative from the tribes that had people represented in Rome. And then it just continued to grow from there, as we'll talk a little bit. Now, Romulus, within the myth around him, it seems as though he never really died. He went out in a thunderstorm and just disappeared. And later he's worshipped as Quirinus, somebody who is seen to have been taken up to be divine. You see, interestingly, with this, some of the, like the imitation almost like of Elijah being taken up and never really dying and things like that. Then you had Numa Pompilius. His reign began at the time that northern Israel was being taken captive by Syria. And he was from a neighboring Sabine tribe. And the religious rites of Rome is what he kind of developed. Political leadership and religious leadership in Rome were almost one and the same. That's why eventually Caesar is also Pontifex Maximus, which happens to be the same title as the Pope. How about that? But there's this Pontifex Maximus, and he was the one who would go in and offer the sacrifices to Jupiter and some of those things. But the religious aspect of Rome was founded really at this time. And Rome went from military camp to a regional religious center during this time as well. Now, when you think of the Romans, you don't typically think of them as being very religious. It's actually completely the opposite. In fact, their historians, I can't remember which one, at some point in the curriculum we'll come across it, but their historians said the reason they were capable of conquering so much land was because of how pious they were to the gods. Because every place that they went, they actually offered sacrifices to the god of that area and said, we will serve you better if you give us victory. And so they actually claimed that it was from that piety. The Romans were a very religious society. I remember reading through the Saxon math book that most kids use in high schools today, or a lot of kids use in high school today, and talked about the Greeks and the Romans, who were the first to bring us out of all of that superstitious stuff, and they weren't all religious, and like, you did not read the history of Rome and Greek, because they were completely superstitious. And that's why Paul even says, he goes into Athens, which is the height of all of Greek philosophy, and he's, I see you are a very religious people. They have an altar to every possible god, and even the one just in case they forgot. So it's like, that's not true of them at all. But that is, I want you guys to catch, that's how the Enlightenment took history and twisted it and made the Romans and the Greeks look like they were like us in this modern society. And Christianity is what darkened that. And so it's like there was this light of intellectualism in the Greco-Roman Empire. Christianity suffocates that, and then the Enlightenment brings it back out. Total twist of history. Total wreck of it as well. During Numa Pompilius, that's when Rome becomes more religious and it gets those established. Then you have Tullius Hostilius. So opposite of the predecessor, he sought a lot of military conquest, and he's the one who destroyed the city of Alba Longa, that was kind of the father city to Rome. And as a result, it seemed, it led to a plague. And they said he was struck by Jupiter and killed. And so his dishonoring of that move toward religion built into the Roman psyche, we need to make sure that we're good on following the religion. Then you have Ancus Marcius, chosen by the Roman Senate, and he's established the plebeian citizen class. So the plebes were already there, but this becomes an actual official designation for those in Rome who are not of the patrician ruling class, but they're still citizens within Rome and still kind of protected by it. And so he established many of the religious rights and offices of Rome and further developed their religion. And his reign is said to have been a time of peace and religious reflection, and it went back to being a regional center. I'm just realizing that that's a copy from up above, and I will check and see which one that actually is supposed to be with, because I think that was an accident on copying and pasting. So then you have Tarquinius Priscus. In case you're wondering why I'm pronouncing things the way that I am, in the Roman Latin there were no soft C's, no soft T's, everything was pronounced different. The best part about that is Caesar's famous phrase, I came, I saw, I conquered, which would usually be Vini, Vidi, Vici, but it actually was Weenie, Weedy, Wiki. It doesn't quite have the same impact. So Tarquinius Priscus, he's the first Etruscan to be on the throne. So you talk about the different cultures. So somebody from the Etruscan culture now is on the throne of Rome. And he conquered the Latin and the Sabine tribes that were right near Rome. And he's the one who founds the games and starts the tradition of the Roman triumph. So the games where you now have people coming and competing to the death, and then you also have the Roman triumph was that when you would conquer someplace, you would arrive back in Rome, and it would be this organized parade where you would come in and parade all the spoils and everything else. And at the end of the triumph, you would have the king of the people, or the highest ranking person that you captured. They'd be at the end, and they would get up to the end of the triumph, and that person would be killed in front of the whole crowd. And it was kind of, that was the final thing of the battle. Now, in years subsequent to that, it got to where they brought them up and they symbolically went to kill him, but he was pardoned and so he also is the one who built the Circus Maximus and the famed Roman sewer. So as the city is expanding, he builds this sewer system within that, And so sewers were not like brand new to humanity. You would be surprised how long ago we actually had indoor plumbing. We don't always think of it as such, but there were toilets amongst the really wealthy. They were actually almost like flush toilets, but there was plumbing. There was a lot of pipes. In fact, part of what led to the unhealthiness within Rome was the lead pipes that they used eventually, and the lead poisoning that they got. The Circus Maximus, if you go there today, it's not, it's kind of a big open area, and you can see some ruins sticking out of the hills and stuff, but this is predating the, what's it called? Come on. It's a really big one. Colosseum, thank you. It was predating Colosseum by 600 years plus. This is where the games started, and they had a lot of racing and so on and so forth. As we're going to see when we get into the Roman culture, sports and racing were a huge thing, but they were directly tied to politics. Political parties supported the different teams, and the teams were separated by color. And so, you know how we have blue and red for Republicans? You'd have the red team, you'd have the blue team, so each political party had their sports. So they were very closely linked, politics and sports. And then you have, it's during this time, by the way, Tarquinius Priscus, that Jerusalem falls to the Babylonians in 586 BC. Then you have Servius Tullius, and he implemented a new constitution, and this is where you really start to see their government taking form. He further developed the Roman social class system, builds the Temple of Diana on the Capitoline Hill, one of the wonders of the ancient world. And this is the time that Daniel is predicting the rise of Rome. So we've got to make sure I'm forwarding this through. So what I want you guys to catch is Rome at this point is still a city-state. They're not very big. In fact, at this time, they're about the size that Jerusalem is after the Jews come back from Babylon. It's just a city with some areas surrounding it conquered, and the different little cities that they have in their control. So here's Daniel predicting this next empire that's going to come with great detail, and especially when it comes to the description of the army, as we're going to see. And so him predicting this is not like Rome's knocking on the door looking to be a superpower. It was very small. Then you have Tarquinius Superbus, or Superbus is probably how it was pronounced, second Etruscan to be on the throne, and he ruled as just a tyrannical king, and just, as it says here, with absolute power. I mean, he crushed anybody who tried to go against him. The injustices of his rule led to a revolt, and the king and the family were cast out of Rome, and now they found the Republic. And what happens is that the Senate votes to never ever again have a king. You say, well, what was Caesar? Well, Caesar never took the title Rex, which would be king. It was interesting. There was a time. So with Julius Caesar, or was it with Caesar Augustus? It was Julius Caesar, where Mark Antony and a big crowd of people took a crown and went to place it on Caesar's head, and Caesar rejects it. So it's kind of like this big symbolic, I'm not going to be king, but they were also testing the waters to see if the people were going to say, no, we want him to be king. But it basically, through all of its history, never again takes on a king. Now, even when you get to the emperors, they still have at least in form, a republican government, where you have the Senate and the tribunal and all these other things that are there. They often were there just in namesake because they didn't have the guts to stand up to the emperor. But technically, they still were the ones who ruled. The Roman world had the imperial provinces, which were ruled directly by the emperor, but the peninsula of Italy was technically ruled by the Senate and the tribunes. And so, in founding the Republic, Lucius Junius Brutus and Lucius Tarquinius Collatinus who had led the revolt, these are the first ones to be elected co-consuls. Now, consuls within the Roman political system are similar to the president and vice president of today. The difference being they were equal. And it was actually set up, one would typically be patrician, one would typically be plebeian. But they were equal in that sense. Both were able to go and lead armies and so on and so forth. This Lucius Junius Brutus is Brutus, the one et tu Brutus that Caesar is stabbed by. He was tied with this Junius Brutus, who had put down this King Tarquinius Superbus, and that's one of the reasons why he was so important to the plot against Caesar, because it tied back into this history of standing against tyranny and kings, and it was a strong symbolism that would have they thought would bring the people back to Tarquinius Superbus and not want Caesar to be in that position. So the Roman Republic really kicks off around 500 BC. And in around 500 BC, this is around the time that you're starting to see the returns back to the land of Judea from at that time, the Empire of Persia. During this time, class struggles are the biggest thing that begin to threaten the Republic. So the patrician class had all the political power, and the plebeian class, then, whenever they didn't get their way or there was an injustice, they would just go on a strike. They would actually get up, leave the city, and go somewhere else. And so all of a sudden, these patricians were left to do their own work, and they didn't like that. And that kept happening until they finally have a negotiation that results in the position of a tribune being developed. Now, originally, the tribune was just a single person. It eventually gets made to 10 people, and then it eventually becomes a whole body of people like the Senate. Oops. There we go. And so the plebeians, this tribune, what the idea was is they were referred to as being sacrosanct. Now we have that word in English now, but what that meant for them was that the plebeians could appoint a person to speak for them and represent them to the Senate, and that person being sacrosanct meant no one could harm them at all. If anyone threatened them and harmed them in any way, they were put to death. So it prevented that person from being strong-armed by the Senate into doing things, and it gave them the courage to go and to speak to them. And then eventually that position is given a veto power where it can veto decisions of the Senate that the plebes were strongly against. And so this tribunal position becomes actually a pretty powerful position, and we're eventually going to see that's how Caesar jumps in, even though he's not a plebeian. We're going to see how that gets mixed up eventually, but he's able to jump in and use that to gain some of his power. Eventually the plebes gain the ability to intermarry with the patricians. Now they have this ability to move up in Roman society. Because they're able to now have, they marry into the patrician, now their kids can be moving into the patrician class. This becomes something that really impacts things in the long run, because as we're going to see, one of the people that become very important in Roman history, there was a plebe who was extremely rich, and then a patrician family that was extremely poor, and they married together and consolidated a lot of power and wealth all at once. And that's kind of where that ended up going. So this plebeian council begins to work, and it's the tribunal, and it functions a lot like the House of Representatives in our government. And then plebes with wealth would began to join a new class that they called equestrians, which it meant you have a horse. And so typically what it was is if you were brought into the patrician class, it meant you were able to arm and bring to battle 100 men, and that's why they were called centuries. And so you could do that, and then for a equestrian, it meant you had enough money and to be able to outfit a horse and have your own armor and so on and so forth. And so you'd be a knight or an equestrian. And this brought a second status in kind of this middle class into Roman culture. Then you have, the Roman conquest of the Italian peninsula. But first, with Daniel's prophecy, you have is what? Oh, that's what messed me up in my mind when I saw Daniel's prophecy. So when we first start off, Rome at the time of Daniel's prophecy is just that city with a little bit of influence around it. So from up to about 500 BC, this is where it was at Daniel's prophecy in actuality, the red that is here. And so on the peninsula, this process of gaining control of the peninsula takes a long time. And so you first have them conquering this little bit, and this is when they're then after they own this much, the Latins, which was the tribe to the south of them, attack them, and they have war with them, and they eventually conquer the Latins. And so around 338 BC, they are in control of this much. Now, to put this in perspective, 325 BC, so this is only like 13 years later, is when Alexander the Great takes the entire Persian Empire. And this is where Rome is at that time. Then, after the Latin War, they have the Samnite Wars. There's the first and second Samnite War, and right before the start of the third Samnite War, basically the Romans had taken all of what you see there. The reason why there's a third Samnite War is because this is that section that the Samnites still control. And so then one thing I forgot to bring up here is right at the time, during the time of the Latin War, this is when you had the Gauls' sack of Rome. So in 387 BC, so just before this, the Gauls come down and sack Rome, and this becomes something that puts the Gauls into a category of greatly to be feared by the Romans, like the arch enemy of the Romans, because they came down and they did that. And so there's a, it's like when you said Gaul to a Roman at this point, it'd be like saying Russian to us. Like it's like that's the enemy kind of thing. And so, and then during this time, the army, leading up through this time, armies are being put together much the way armies in the ancient world were. And that is, you have citizens. When it's time for battle, you call upon all the citizens. Everyone tries to bring their own equipment, and you equip them as best as they can. And then they go off and they fight. But it's around here, in this time, that they start having more standardized weapons that they make and provide for the soldiers. And then you have them eventually, at the end of the Third Samnite War, they control the central part of the Italian peninsula. Then they have the Pyrrhic Wars, which is really fighting against the Greeks. And so the Greeks had settled a great deal of this area. There were two strong Greek cities here, and that were supplied very well from the other side of the sea. But after a long fight, they eventually, in the mid-2nd century BC, begin to have control of that. So really, the Italian peninsula, which for much of the ancient world, Italy proper was from here south. You had a river coming in here. I'm trying to remember the name of that one. I don't remember. It's a more legit river. But then a small one coming up here called, anyone want to guess? Think of what Caesar had to cross?
Rubicon.
The Rubicon. That's right. So a small little river called the Rubicon. So the Rubicon River and the other river really was the end of Roman territory, and then Gaul was considered a province, not part of the actual Italy. So you have this time where they're conquering the Italian peninsula, And as they conquer each of these cultures, they're absorbing a lot of the cultures and mixing. And this is where you're seeing some of what you see of that what do we call it in America? We call it salad bowl now, but originally it was called
Melting pot.
melting pot. Thank you. So you see this melting pot concept. Now, similar to America, in this first part, they're bringing together cultures of greater similarity from a similar region, so you can have a melting pot. Now, why have we gone from the expression of melting pot to salad bowl?
Because each wants to keep their own ethnicity.
Right. So now, instead of wanting to come in and wanting to be American and trying to be American, now you have multiple cultures from a larger range, not just European or Western European. You have a very large range from Asia and everywhere coming in that want to preserve their culture, and they don't mix as much. That same thing begins to happen with the Roman Empire eventually, and it's part of what led to some of the upheaval at the end of the time of the Republic, but especially great upheaval when the Roman Empire started to fall out of power. And so it's also during this time that the idea of Roman citizenship develops, because the question comes, it was kind of like, well, you're all in Rome and you're all in here, but it's like, well, what happens to the Samnites and the Etruscans that are from further away? What are they going to do? And for a long time, they're like, well, you're just Samnites, you're just this. But then they had people that were Roman citizens that were getting all of this favor and benefits from all the taxes and everything else like that. But here are these Samnites that weren't. And eventually what happens is that everything from, this area that we talked about all the way down becomes places where if you're in that area and born in that area, you are a Roman citizen. But in being a Roman citizen, you are a citizen of the city of Rome. So that's one of those interesting concepts. It's not the same as national citizenship, quite like we think of it. So it's in the end 264 BC, and right before the start of the First Punic War, that they finally conquer the entire peninsula. This is when they defeat the Etruscans and capture all the way over to the other coast. Now, during this time period then, Rome is controlling this here. The Greeks have settlements all around here. Now, also at this time, this is now the Seleucid Empire that we talked about, and the Ptolemaic Empire that we talked about. But this is still before the Jews rebel against those empires. And so during that time, what you see here is Carthage, who has a great deal of control here, and Rome, they start to come into contact and they don't get along very well. Now the Carthaginians, they are actually Phoenicians. So what you see over here in Tyre and Sidon, they control the ports up along Lebanon and Cyprus, and then they have this huge control over here. They started in Tyre. So the Carthaginians began as a settlement similar to Rome, much smaller, during the time of Solomon, when Solomon is partnering, and actually David too, with Hiram, the king of Tyre, and doing trade all around the Mediterranean. They're trading with these settlements that are Phoenician settlements that develop into all of these areas that Carthage then becomes in control of. And it takes a while for Carthage to raise to a greater prominence than Tyre, but basically the destruction of Tyre at the time that Alexander takes it really pushes Carthage up to the top as like the Phoenician capital, and it becomes to get a lot more powerful. And so that is who Rome is fighting with during the Punic Wars. So the Carthaginians are actually Canaanites. So they, because the Tyre and Sidon were Canaanite settlements. So Carthage is founded in 814 BC during the reign of Joash, the southern king of Judah. So it was a settlement in this area, but when we know it was founded as a city, is 814. King Jehu of northern Israel died in 814 BC and was succeeded by his son Jehoahaz. So that when that is happening in the Old Testament is when Carthage is being founded as a city. The Phoenicians were superior sailors, and Rome has a real hard time because Rome is, you'll notice, Rome does not have settlements on the islands and stuff because they were not major seafarers at this point. They were dependent upon the Greeks and the Carthaginians to do a lot of their sailing and trade. When they start to then get more powerful, Carthage starts to get worried and they start to fight with them. That's when Rome says, okay, we need to start developing a navy. And so the Romans and Carthaginians originally clashed then here in Sicily. So you can see, you've got just a short little jaunt, and there's this little bit here. So the Romans get into this area and want to take this, but you have the Greeks and you have the Carthaginians and then the Romans all on this island, and they have a major outbreak of war then, and it starts here in Sicily and spreads. So the effects of the Punic Wars on Rome, the war with Carthage forced Rome to develop a robust navy. They actually come up with a design for a ship. I don't want to speak wrongly. I think they had what were called triremes, and I can't remember if they developed the trireme or if the Greeks had the trireme and Carthaginians had the trireme, and then they developed one up from that. But they actually brought in people to help them develop a better ship than what the Carthaginians had. Navies at this time functioned primarily by ramming each other. So you had guys on oars, big ram on the front of the boat, and you had to outmaneuver them so that you could get alongside and ram them and sink them. They would also sometimes try to come up alongside and have bridges that would drop down onto the boat next, and then it was just hand to hand. You didn't have guns basically firing at each other. The failures with the Punic Wars forced Rome to develop a more flexible military structure and pushed it into some of the developments of the military that they end up having later on. So some of the famous battles that develop Roman military lore, when you have big battles that are remembered and commemorated. If you've ever watched, for instance, The Gladiator, it's a lot of stuff that they did within that amphitheater was reenact famous battles that had been told to them. So one, Hannibal's campaign taking elephants through Hispania, Gaul, and then over the Alps is one of the most famous of all of the campaigns against Rome that put Rome in the greatest amount of fear. So Hannibal, instead of going across this way, which you think would have made sense, takes all of his elephants and his army all along the coast, across to the Iberian Peninsula at the Straits of Gibraltar, and then he comes up around here to Rome. Now, he did this, one, to surprise them from coming from the opposite direction that you'd expect. But he thought that as he went through these areas that were beginning to be influenced by Rome, that he would build on the anti-Roman sentiment and build a bigger army than what he actually had, and that he would be supported and fed as he went through because everybody would be anti-Roman. That happened a little bit, not nearly as much as he thought. So by the time he's coming through the Alps, he does not have the army he thought that he would have, but he still is such a brilliant general that he wreaks havoc all throughout the Italian peninsula. One of the best battles, most interesting to me, there was a lake that had like this crescent moon-shaped mountain ridge, and so there's like that a little place on the shore of the lake, and what Hannibal did is they camped on that crescent moon-shaped ridge, but then built campfires like 10 miles east of there, so that the Romans thought that the Carthaginians were 10 miles east. And so the Romans went to attack them, and as they went between that crescent-shaped moon and the lake, they just rushed down out of that ridge, trapped the Romans against the lake, and massacred them. And that shows you some of the brilliance that Hannibal had. The Roman general who finally defeats Hannibal is Scipio Africanus. Now, when you read the name of a Roman general and it has like a location, like Germanicus, Africanus, Asiaticus, that means that's the area they're responsible for having defeated. So they would receive that moniker after defeating something. So he's called Scipio Africanus, not because he fought in Africa, although he does eventually do that, but because he defeated the forces from Africa. And so once he defeats Hannibal, it now becomes, in essence, a world power. This is happening, getting closer to the time of the Maccabean revolt. So you can see why when we hear Judas and them coming to power, they're hearing about what's happening over in Rome and that it's becoming a world power, and that's why they're interacting with them. So the results from the defeat of Carthage, Hannibal is banished, and he actually goes to fight with Antiochus the Great. So Antiochus the Great, Antiochus III, who had been over the area of Judea, he was the one who was fighting against the Greeks and wanted to go into Egypt and fight against Egypt. But when he was up in the area of Turkey and he was starting to encounter the Romans more, then he ends up helping, and Antiochus III ends up calling upon Hannibal because of his success against Rome to come and fight for him. Now, Antiochus III is the father of Antiochus Epiphanes. So Hannibal is, that much connected, I guess you say, to the story of what we see in the intertestamental period. Once you get to the Second Punic War and Rome defeats Carthage, they just utterly destroy it and they salt all the land around Carthage. Now, what happens if you salt all the land?
Nothing grows.
Nothing will grow. So Carthage can't recover for quite some time after that. This makes Rome basically the master of the Western Mediterranean. And because of all these battles, it floods Rome with slaves. And so all of a sudden you start to have some civic upheaval because slaves are taking the jobs that used to be done by paid freedmen, and there's all these different things that are happening, and slave treatment was not exactly great at that time. And so you're going to see from this point on, once they conquer Carthage, slavery is going to become an issue for the Romans to deal with. And then being master of the Western Mediterranean, so at this point, this is at the end of the First Punic War. Then they end up conquering all of this, and it took till then to conquer this little bit because this was that was held by the Greeks. But around 197 to 100 BC, this is what they're conquering. Now it's in 168 BC that Jerusalem gains its that it rebels against Antioch and the Greeks, and it's during this time then that Rome is in contact then with the Jews, and so they gain all of this control by 100 BC. Hold on a second, I'm getting ahead of myself. The Romans and the Greeks, so the 200 to 50 BC, the Romans are conquering into this area, and you have, when they get into the area of Greece, they end up coming in, they defeat them in battle, but because they have such respect for the Greek culture, they actually give the Greeks freedom to rule themselves. There are like some taxes and such, but other than that, freedom, and they do not station any soldiers in Greece. That's the biggest thing. There's no legions put into Greece. The respect for the Greek culture and the very fact that they were used to absorbing cultures is why they often say that Rome conquered Greece militarily, but Greece conquered Rome culturally. And this is why you have Greco-Roman culture. Because once they get into this time of conquering Greece, they really absorb the Greek culture and become very Greek themselves as well. However, one of the big things that happens during this time that affects things for centuries and affects the church is this western side all continue to speak Latin. But everything from here east speak Greek. And that's why eventually you have the division between Roman Catholicism and the Greek Orthodox. It leads to that because of that linguistic divide of the Mediterranean. Now, as they give the Greeks good treatment, and so the Greeks actually come right in behind and support the Romans in what they're doing. The Romans have a war with Philip V of Macedonia, and that led to the Greeks siding with Rome even more. So here in Macedonia, they had been kind of over the Greeks for quite some time since Alexander. And what ends up happening is because they're fighting against Philip, the Greeks actually join with him, and he ends up conquering Macedonia. And during this time, I don't know if I have it in here or not, but I believe it's during this time that Philippi had been built by King Philip, and then it's destroyed and rebuilt by the Romans, but it's still named Philippi. So that's sort of part of the history of the city of Philippi that Philippians is written to. Instead of having to fight tons of battles throughout the whole Greek area, they're able to actually take control through diplomacy and politics instead. The Roman general T. Quintius Flaminius, he makes a treaty of freedom with the Greek cities, gives them self-governance, and they're not garrisoned with Romans, which I had said, and then the Greek culture, I did teach all that. How about that? I guess you just really, say, Dwayne, you already taught that. So, then the other gains around the Mediterranean. Rome gains here in Hispania, and so there are various wars that begin to happen here as Rome gets more influence in this area that used to be controlled by Carthage. The tribes in Hispania begin to fight against them. However, many of the tribes in Hispania liked the Romans. So some of the tribes sided with the Romans, and some of them sided with the others that were the Hispanic tribes, and they would fight against each other, but Rome continued to defeat them, and took control of this entire area of Hispania. They also, the kingdom of Pergamum, this area right here, I had told you guys last week that it was Lydia. It's actually the kingdom of Pergamum, which included Lydia and some of those things. But the kingdom of Pergamum is just willed to Rome when the king dies and he has no heir. So without any battles or any conquest, they receive this area and it becomes Roman. Now, that is going to factor into many of the things that we see in that area with the gospel going in, because that area was extremely pro-Caesar. And what you have in the book of Revelation to the 7 churches that are in that entire area, what is thought by many, if not most, scholars, is they are fighting against a culture that if you want to be accepted, you have to pledge allegiance to Caesar and offer an offering to him. And if you're not willing to do that, you're not a good citizen and you're not patriotic, and so you're not worthy of being traded with. And so they didn't get business. And sometimes it even got to the point where they would be persecuted, imprisoned, or even killed. Then Cilicia is taken by the Romans, and Tarsus, Paul's hometown, becomes the seat of the Roman government. So this little blob right here, if you remember what I said last week, that part was taken because of, anyone? What was going on that caused them to jump over this middle area and conquer that? Piracy. Very good. So piracy was active in that area, and so they go over and they take that area to try to control that, and they establish Tarsus as a Roman colony. This is why Paul is a Roman citizen, because he is born in a Roman colony. Roman colonies, the cities that were established as a Roman colony, was a little Rome. So if you were born in it, you were born in the city of Rome in the way that they saw it. Then you have the war with Mithridates, and this is where now we're getting into a little bit closer where we stopped last week. This area here is the kingdom that Mithridates was reigning in, and as a result, all of northern Asia Minor comes under Rome's control as well. Now, when these areas come under Roman control, just so you know, it's way more complex than what I'm saying. They come under Roman control, then they rebel against it, and Rome has to send armies in, and then they gain more control over here, they lose control over this. It's not just as simple as like they went into control, boom. It's very complex, but if I did all of that to you tonight, you'd be even more overwhelmed with information than we're already going to be going home tonight. So just, be patient with that. Then you have Pompey. He clears the Mediterranean of pirates entirely. So Pompey is very highly thought of by the Romans because he was able to literally just stop piracy. And you really don't hear a lot of the piracy after Pompey clears that. And then after he clears that of piracy, and he was a big part of taking more of this area, he then takes the area of Antioch, and he conquers what remains of the Seleucid Empire. And then this is when he comes down, and this is when we have Hyrcanus you know what I'm talking about, Hyrcanus II and Aristobulus II, who plead with him, and then Pompey comes down to Jerusalem, and that's when he lays siege to it, enters the temple, but then puts Hyrcanus into power. So during this time you have all of that being conquered, and then Caesar is conquering in Gaul during this same time period, and so that's a big overview of what we are getting into. Now, Caesar actually does a cross-the-channel attack into England as well at this time. First person to ever do that, and he had a very large navy. The next time that was matched was D-Day. His navy was that big. But when he got over there, it was just at first thought to be too difficult to maintain it. But they did go in and establish a few footholds there that allows them to more easily attack later on. So all of this expansion in this region leads to a decline of the republic, meaning a decline not in power and importance, but a decline from being a republic into being an empire. And so we're going to backtrack a little bit and talk about once they had conquered Carthage, slaves become an issue. And these large number of slaves come in, they're serving, they're treated poorly, they have no rights, and it starts to cause upheaval and conflict with workers, and they start being treated very poorly. But suddenly the slaves begin to realize there's a lot of us, and this is bad for them. By the way, this was one of the greatest fears prior to the Civil War that Americans had that we don't really think about. They were very, very afraid of slave uprisings, and I'm always amazed we didn't have one. It still blows my mind that because of the numbers that were there in the South, they far outnumbered the whites in the South. So it's kind of shocking with that. But the slave rebellions first occur in Sicily. In Sicily, there was a ruler who was particularly harsh on slaves, who gave them no rights, didn't care at all about them. And you could pretty much do anything. You could kill off your slave and there'd be no consequence at all. In many areas of the world, even a slave, if you killed a slave, you still had a punishment. You still had consequences or things like that. But it was, there was nothing to guard against that. And so the slaves begin to rise up, and they actually fight for 3 years on Sicily and wreak havoc in that area. And the Romans are now scared that that's going to catch on. The famed Spartacus is the one who led the largest and most fearsome of these. And how many of you guys have seen the movie Spartacus? Okay, so you know the basic. Yeah, you know the basic gist that he was a gladiator, but who led this slave revolt. What's intriguing about that, most intriguing for me, is their main place of hiding out, Mount Vesuvius, before it erupted. So they were up in the crater of that and in that area hiding out. And it's like, man, if that eruption had happened a little bit earlier, they'd have been in trouble. And so the slave revolts are there, but they also have the political unrest amongst the rest of their citizens because the jobs are being taken away. The plebeians are upset. There's for instance, during this time, there's laws introduced like 30% of your labor force has to be freedmen. They can't, you can't have more than 70% as slaves, things like that, to try to make sure that there were jobs for people. During this time, this is when all of those Italian tribes who had a form of citizenship come and say, we want equal citizenship that's equal to the rest of Rome, and that becomes granted to them as well. Now we get a little bit more in detail with the politics just at the end of what's going on here. You first have the Gracchi brothers, Tiberius and Gaius. Their father had been consul, so like their father had been like president. In 133 to 121 BC, this is when these two guys become consuls, and this is during the reign of John Hyrcanus that we had talked about with the Maccabeans, or the Hasmoneans. They both served as Roman tribunes, so they were the representing of the lower class plebeians, but they were actually patricians, and you're like, how did that happen? Well, eventually it got to where plebeians could be made consul, and then they would be moved up into the Senate class, them and their descendants, after they served as consul. But there was a balancing of that in allowing patricians to then begin to serve as tribunes. And it was kind of a weird flip with that. And so they serve as tribunes, and they're standing up and using some of their veto power and ticking off the Senate because they're trying to get the popular people to really follow them. And so Tiberius rose to power first. Gaius came after him and went to a further extreme than his brother. They tried to harness the power of the plebeians by bringing out reforms that said, hey, there's all of these lands, public lands that are owned by Rome. We need to divide these up amongst the plebeians and the veterans of our army. And so it was this kind of a land offer that was out there, which obviously gained the support of the common person within Rome. And then some of the massive holdings that these patricians had, they wanted to break those up and give those out to people as well. And this was why I said that the forces having to be at least 30% freedmen against the slavery. So all of these Roman citizens who were the plebeian class loved the policies of the Gracchi brothers. Senate did not. The Senate hated this. And so Tiberius, what happens with Tiberius is he was proposing his policies as, there was this riot that broke out, and somehow in that riot he accidentally got clubbed to death. So that's how he ends. And then Gaius stabbed by his own servants to avoid arrest. So he knew the arrest was coming. He didn't want to go through what they were going to do to him. Then you have Marius who comes in, and he commanded Roman forces against Numidia. So if you look at Carthage, there's the kingdom that is west of that, going along toward, not Tunisia. Oh well, you guys understand. Going along the north coast of Africa toward the Atlantic Ocean. That was the Numidians, and he had gone down and he had fought very well and was a brilliant general. And so he gained a lot of popularity in that way. And then he was a plebeian who married into the patrician family of Caesarus or Caesar. So as a plebeian, he was not able to get into power, but by marrying the Caesars, he could. See, the Caesar family had become totally broke. So I don't remember for sure if there was like gambling involved, but there's like the family had lost all of its fortune. It had no money to it. It was patrician, and that was it. So Marius marrying into it took the family of Caesars and lifted it up, but then he got the political power. As a result, though, he ends up being then the great uncle of Gaius Julius Caesar, and that's how Caesar's family rose to that prominence. The military reforms that Marius brought were very important for what subsequently happens with the Roman Empire. He is the one who takes the military and brings it to its full form that we know of today. And our military, by the way, is completely structured off of what Marius did with the Roman army. He's the first one to develop a professional standing army in the ancient world, or at least one of the first. There's some debate as to who did it first, but he definitely raised the largest standing army. Now, what do we mean by standing army? Anyone know what we mean by that?
Full-time professional soldiers.
Full-time professional soldiers. They don't go back and work their land. They don't go home. They are stationed somewhere, and they are working all year round as a soldier. Now, some of the things that come from this move, one is this workforce then that they have becomes also something that helps extend some of the more important things within the Roman culture, like the Roman road system that was built for the military primarily, and it was marked out with every 1,000 paces that you would take, they put a marker. Anyone know what that marker was called? It was called a mile marker. I wonder why a mile is such a weird number of feet. It's because that's 1,000 paces. And if you mark that out, that's about what it would be. And so they built the ancient Roman roads, the bridges, the aqueducts, and the water systems. So the military often were part of building those things as a standing army. But they're also very well structured. So you've heard of a legion, and looks like my animation got out of order here. Yep. Okay. Wow, it like disappeared really fast, doesn't it? You guys have it here in your thing. You have basically a contubernium, which is basically tenting together. Tubernium would be a tent. Con is together. So these are your tent mates, and that would be a squad of 8. And then a centuria, which would be approximately 100, but it's actually 8 times 10, which would be 80. And then you would get to a cohort, which would be 6 centuria, which would be 480. Now you're wondering, like, well, why is it called a century, centuria or a century if it's not 100? This is the fighting soldiers. As you went out, you also had cooks and supply sergeants and things like that. And that's why when you get to the full legion being 4,800, but you're like, I thought they said legions were between 5,000 and 6,000, because there's a lot of others, non-fighting men that would be with it. But a legion was not set at its 6,000. It flexed within that. But fighting men were organized in this way: 8, and then 80, and then 480, and then 4,800. So organizing them this way with a command structure allowed for a much more organized battlefield, a much clearer way to communicate and to divide up tasks and such. Today, in American military, this is a squad. This would be a company, or if you're cavalry like I was, you were a troop. And then this would be a squadron or a brigade, and then this would be division, I think, is what it would be. So, but we follow much the same structure and organization. The other thing, come on, there we go. So they developed two weapons were developed. The gladius and the pilum had different forms, but they become standardized by Marius. The Roman pilum is given a design that is made. If you can look here, you got the metal part that goes through here that's broken in, but it's made to break off, so that as you are in a battle and you're going and you stab and it hits somebody's shield, and they try to pull it out of the shield, it breaks off. Now, why is that? Because otherwise, you throw your spear, it hits somebody's shield, they pull it out, and now they got a spear. And so they made it to break off so that the enemy couldn't reuse it. The gladius becomes the standardized sword during Marius's time, and the difference of this from other swords is it's double-edged and shorter, so it's far more effective when you're holding a shield and everything else to be using the shorter sword than this really long one that you've got to back away with your shield and such like that. And these two developments in the technology end up really giving the Roman army a great advantage against everybody that they're going against. They also have very clear strategies and how they go into a battle. If you guys have ever seen Gladiator in the beginning scenes, they're pretty rough to watch, but you see them putting all their shields together, putting the shields on top, and then they formulate a standard way of fighting and train in it. And so it's also Marius who establishes the eagle as the symbol for Rome. And this becomes what is on the top of all of their standards. So prior to Marius, as the armies would go out, they would carry a standard, and each one had a different, like one would have a boar, one would have a deer, they'd have different things. He came out and said they're all the eagle, and he took away all the separate standards. And the SPQR is the Senatus Populusque Romanus, which is the Senate and people of Rome. This is now, you're fighting for Rome. You're not fighting for this general or that general. You're fighting for Rome. And so some of these reforms really strengthened the army. Now, when Marius did these reforms, he also did so under the power of council, and he was with kind of the same political background as the Gracchi brothers, which was more on the plebeian side and helping the common man, to be that. So Lucius Cornelius Sulla comes in. He is pro-Senate and pro-Republic, and he would be like the conservative, wanting to support the patrician class and bring back kind of the old Roman Empire. And so he comes in and he kind of contests with Marius for power. During the conflict, Sulla twice marches on Rome with his legions, which is unheard of. As he does, the Senate then gives in to what Sulla is demanding, and this kind of sets a precedent that Julius Caesar will later follow when he crosses the Rubicon. He will look back and see, Sulla, did that. Now, Marius dies soon after Sulla. Soon after this contest, but Sulla has to still fight Marius's supporters, and this turns into a massive upheaval within the Roman culture, and so the Senate appoints Sulla as dictator, and this is just kind of Latin. Basically, you have to do what he says. That's kind of what dictator means. To dictate is to say something, and so he becomes a dictator. And he is basically in that position given full power to do anything he wants. And he does that. He puts down the uprising after Marius's death. And then when he's done putting all of that down, he then turns power back over to the Senate. Now, he's the only Roman general to actually do that. There are many Roman generals and emperors after this point that ceremonially do this, but they don't actually do that. But Sulla actually did. In fact, when he was done, he went off to his cottage, and unfortunately for history and for us in any way liking Sulla, He went off to his cottage in the mountains, and he and his homosexual partner went on into the years of retirement, having really weird dramas and stuff at his thing, and it's kind of weird. You would not expect this, like, you know, strong Roman general to have that kind of end, but it does show you as well how common even at that time that sort of life was. So we still got none for A. Any questions that you guys have about this? Yeah.
Dwayne, what do you consider all the similarities between Rome and the United States now?
So
Before their culture fell, where do you put us in that aspect of?
did you as we're going through this, did you guys pick up and hear the similarities?
Yeah,
You know, Sulla was MAGA,
yeah.
make Rome great again.
God bless them.
Okay, so well then yeah, that's what I'm saying. I knew somebody would say it. What you find, and this is why I've shared sometimes with students, is that we're not far from empire. We're not far from that point. Now, the United States, you may have heard at one time, I think it was, I don't remember which president it was, but the president of Colombia, like when he met with our president, like gave him this book about the American Empire. It's like almost like an insult, you know, kind of thing. There are many ways that we have an empire similar to Rome, except in one very important distinction: taxes. Okay, so we have, like, for instance, we have soldiers in Korea. We have I'm going to go back a little ways because I don't know where we've pulled out of, but when I was in the army, we had soldiers in Korea, we had soldiers in the Philippines, we had soldiers in Japan, we had soldiers in Germany, we still have soldiers in Malta. We have soldiers all over the place helping to protect and prop up our allies. How much we charge them for that, I have no idea, but we don't tax them. So we don't go to Korea and go, you have to give us this much taxation, which by Roman definition, or by what we see within Latin, that's what real empire is. That's what we talked about earlier. Once the Jews were freed from taxation, they weren't under that empire anymore. However, on another level, we do have the soldiers there, which, in other senses in the ancient world, it would be taxation and those soldiers. Because remember, the Jews said, we don't want the garrisons here, and that's another thing of freedom, is that there's no garrisons present. So we have half of that. Because we have soldiers garrisoned around this world in strategic places. So there is a way in which we have that empire and that influence and that sway within the world as a world power. We also are very similar to Rome in that we are a conglomerate of nationalities. We are a thing that got established over here and drew in everything, but there's no like one ethnic identity with the beginning. Whereas all the other nations, you have that one ethnic identity. Because of that, the cultural upheavals we see happening in Rome are very similar to ours. You have the slavery thing, and now slaves were never, slavery wasn't outlawed, but slavery was a huge issue. But once you have the emperors come in, you don't have the slave revolts that they used to have before. Those are put down very quickly because you have the one emperor. Now, one of the reasons why they moved to an empire, or moved to having, a Julius Caesar and then a Caesar Augustus. We'll talk a little bit more about this in next week. But one of the main reasons they did that is because people prefer peace and affluence to freedom. You'll give up freedoms if you know you get to keep your cell phones and your cars and your travel and your vacations and everything else like that. But if in order to preserve your freedoms, you have to forsake all of that stuff, then people aren't as zealous about the freedom until you go a while without the freedom, then you get zealous for the freedom again. But that's kind of what happens within Rome. Now, because of the way Rome went about their empire, there actually was a great deal of freedom. And so when we talk about the emperor, what we're more talking about is the centralization of power into one man. But that, because that one man still in Roman history reigned not as Rex, not as king, but as emperor, which meant in Italy, he was consul in a republican government. To the imperial provinces, he was a representative of that council in full control of that, but he still represented them. He was not supposedly his own power. Now, what you see in America happening today is people are demanding that certain things be taken care of, and who are they expecting to take care of that?
Government.
The government, but specifically the president. So that now, and what you saw with both Trump and actually you've been seeing it since Bush, but you Bush and then you have Obama and then you have Trump, was this use of executive power with their executive, what do we call it? Executive
Action.
What is it?
Executive action.
Executive actions and stuff like. So it's like, I'm gonna make this take this executive action, and we're gonna do this. When you see that, that's being brought about. People are wanting that because they're sick and tired of the squabbling that's going on in Congress, and they would rather have someone who just take control and just settle the issue and be done with it. So you see a lot of this stuff happening. But add to that, go to our capital. Where did we get all that architectural idea from? It's straight from Rome. The founding fathers will tell you that our republic was based a constitution. They went back, they looked at Rome, and they saw some of the history of Rome and tried to prevent some of those things. There's the reason, that the president is the executive over all of the military forces, the commander-in-chief. He's the commander-in-chief because otherwise you have a general who's having loyalty brought to him who would try to overthrow the commander-in-chief. So there's a lot of things that we tried to repeat Rome and be like it, and there's a lot of ways we are very similar to it. So all the way around, you can see our history paralleling theirs. You start off, you have more separate states, then a greater centralization of the government, and so on and so forth. It's similar here. If you were to read more in detail when I talked about the different tribes and what they had, you'd see that was reflected there as well. So we are very much like Rome, resurrected.
What was their moral standards compared to the United States?
Well, they started on the bad morals and went to Christianity. We started on Christianity, we're going to the bad morals. In Greco-Roman culture, morals was hospitality. How are you treating the stranger that comes in? Morals was how zealous are you to make sure you're doing the right sacrifices at the right time. Had absolutely nothing to do with sexuality. Sexual action was not immoral. Now, the only thing that was thought to be really bad back in that time was to commit adultery, where you violated somebody so that you would create a child that broke up the whole inheritance line. So it wasn't the romantic breaking of a relationship and it's just you broke my heart. It was no, you're screwing up the inheritance and how that's all going to work. And that's why women, when they were married, the married women who gave the rightful heirs, they lived almost entirely separate from the men and took very great pride in how pure they were of the defilements. But their men would go to parties and have sex with different women all the time, and the women they weren't like, you committed adultery, I'm divorcing you. They were like, that's okay, I'm better than her, I'm the one bearing your heir. They didn't really, so the sexual morality issue within Roman culture was, morals and sex weren't an issue. It's like morals were religious, cultural, how you were to people in certain cultural norms. Sexuality was not seen as a moral issue.
How would his line be tainted if she didn't mess around on him?
So so basically, if you have somebody who's very important from the patrician class, or he marries another woman, or he marries a woman from the patrician class, and all of her children are his children, and so they're rightful heirs. A guy from outside the family commits adultery with her. Her descendants now have that right because it is a true marriage. In other words, the parents have legally agreed, we are coming together, they are legally married. Now, if somebody like, well, what about the guy that fell in love and just married somebody, and the parents didn't agree, and it wasn't a legal marriage? That's called a concubine. That's what a concubine is when you concubines involved sometimes marriages and commitments to each other, but it was not approved legally, so any child from that was a bastard child. No matter what, even though he had only a relationship with that person, they could not inherit their grandparents. So in other words, it was a way that the parents and the family leaders protected the inheritance from getting to the unworthy. And so morals had more to do with that, protecting that inheritance, getting the unworthy, than sex outside of marriage was horrible.
So if the husband was sleeping with her and she had an affair with another guy, how would they know whose kid it was? But at that point, they didn't care.
That's why if you were caught in the act of that, that was bad. I mean, obviously there was always contesting. Oh, I think that you're from this woman and another guy, and they would contest somebody. Like we talked about with the one king of John Hyrcanus, when they said, "Oh, you're actually from this Greek soldier," and they would contest. You don't have the rightful inheritance of that because you're actually from this, other relationship, and that's kind of the offense there. And so, if somebody was caught in the act of adultery, that's why it was bad, because you were screwing up that inheritance line and causing all those issues. It was not bad because here's these two souls intimately knit together, and you violated that trust, because that kind of trust was not expected by many.
Did they ever say anything historically about how much homosexuality was going on in Rome?
There's a lot of homosexuality.
I didn't know. So
yeah, there was a lot of homosexuality. There were a lot of people that were effeminate and prostitutes in different ways. If you just go to a Pompeii exhibit, there's rooms that they don't let the kids go into for the Pompeii exhibits. And I'm not saying I recommend that you go into the rooms with Pompeii exhibits, but you will see just how messed up Roman culture was sexually, because it's every bit of perversion you'll find on the internet today. And that's what they painted on their walls and their houses as frescoes in the city of Pompeii.
But they had prostitution too, Daniel.
Oh yeah. They had prostitution. They had courtesans. Courtesans were women that would come into a party for the sake of the entertainment of the men while they were there, and that was just kind of expected. And married women knew that their husbands were most likely doing that. So, and it was just kind of and as off as that seems, I mean, think now how many in our culture they are talking about having open marriages. But because you think, how could a woman or a husband be okay with that? Well, that's what's happening right now. But that was already back then. Marriage was different in their eyes. And what we've come to today is more a reaction to romanticism that occurred, where it's like you're following your heart. And so in other words, the core of marriage is like, oh, I'm so in love with you. I mean, this idea of I'm so in love. That didn't work when you had arranged marriages. And it wasn't always that way. And so when you live in this culture where there's all these arranged marriages for the sake of what's better for the family financially, and the parents are controlling all of that, you can see why it was far more common to be outside of marriage in all these different ways. And women still did that too, trust me, but there were just more severe consequences. And there were women who didn't, but when they didn't, it was because I'm higher class. It was this pride thing, I'm higher class, I'm not one of those women, and I'm chaste so my children are all rightful heirs. It wasn't, I'm chaste because I'm so in love with my husband. So it's just a very different world in a sense. But we're moving into that world. So Rome started with that world and moved into Christianity. And like I said, we started with Christianity and we're moving into that world.